Good morning everyone and welcome to the Cabinet meeting. I'm Councillor Amanda Hopgood, Leader of Durham County Council and Chair of this meeting. The meeting is being broadcast live through our YouTube channel. Before we commence with today's formal business, I'd like to cover some of the housekeeping issues for us all to follow. Please switch off or make silent your mobile phones and all other devices, and keep microphones switched off at all times unless invited to speak by myself as the Chair. When invited to speak, please switch on the microphone nearest to you and introduce yourself. So with that, we'll move on with the agenda. Item 1 is public questions. We haven't had any public questions for today's meeting. Item 2, the minutes of the previous meeting. Can I have a mover and seconder, please, for the minutes of the meeting on the 15th of January?
I'll move that, Chair.
Thank you.
Second, Chair.
Thank you. Can we confirm those minutes are a true record? Okay. I can confirm the minutes have been agreed. Item 3 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations from members this morning, please? No. Okay, with that we'll move straight into item 4, which is a medium-term financial plan 2025-26 to 2028-29. Can I invite Paul Darby, Corporate Director of Resources, to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. This report presents the budget proposals for 25-26 with both revenue and capital, and our medium-term financial plan forecast for the period 25-26 to 28-29. As it is the budget report, there are a number of statutory requirements that wrap around the budget setting process, which are addressed in this report and require Cabinet and Council approval. This includes the pay policy, which is a requirement of the Localism Act, and sets out our arrangements for Chief Officer's pay and how it relates to the lowest paid employees, and this is attached at Appendix 14. Our Treasury Management Strategy and Prudential Indicators, which are attached at Appendix 11, and also attaches the Council's Property Investment Strategy, which we review on an annual basis and which is attached at Appendix 13. This report and our budgets for next year and beyond have been prepared against a backdrop of significant inflationary and demand pressures, particularly in adult and children's social care, and they've been prepared in the context of significant uncertainty that exists beyond 25-26 in terms of government funding levels. The report provides an overview of the autumn statement announcements and the local government finance settlement for 25-26, and this report was prepared just before the final settlement was published on the 3rd of February. An overview of these key government announcements are set out at paragraphs 49 to 100 in the report. The budget proposals in this report will be considered by full Council on the 19th of February, though there will be slight amendments to that report to reflect the final settlement figures. The budget proposals in this report build on the previous reports considered by Cabinet in September and December of last year and in January this year. The report includes an advice note prepared by the Director of Legal and Democratic Services, our Monitoring Officer, setting out the responsibility of all members with regards to facilitating the setting of a balanced budget and the implications of not doing so. That advice note is set out in Appendix 3 to the report. As members will see, the report is very comprehensive. Next year we'll receive an additional £48.7 million of government grant funding. However, £19.5 million of this is specific grant funding. Our core spending power increase is above the England average next year, but this factors in receipt of the new recovery grant and an assumed 4.99% increase in our council tax. Despite this increase in core spending power, the council still lags well behind the national average in terms of core spending power per dwelling, as exemplified in paragraphs 94 and 95 of the report. The overall changes in our funding position, including the impact of the proposed increases in council tax, are summarised in Table 1 at paragraph 102 to the report. The report sets out in some detail the financial pressures we are facing and the growth that is needed next year to address these unavoidable budget pressures linked to inflation, particularly for pay, changes to national insurance contributions, adult social care costs linked to the national living wage and national insurance changes, increases in costs and demand pressures that continue in our children looked after placements budgets and in our home to school transport budgets. These unavoidable cost pressures total £85.8 million and are summarised in Table 2 at paragraph 103 to the report, with more details set out at paragraph 104. The overall position before consideration of savings to help balance the budget next year shows that our budget pressures exceed the resources available to us by £21.2 million, largely because of our inability to raise sufficient council tax locally from permitted increases in council tax because of our low tax base and the government funding we receive in being insufficient to meet that gap. The report includes details of the revisions to the current capital programme to reflect reprofiling and slippage to future years, as well as the receipt of additional grant and other adjustments as discussed by the Capital Member Officer Working Group since the Q2 report was considered at Cabinet in December. These amendments require formal Cabinet endorsement as part of the recommendations to this report, and those revisions are set out at paragraphs 275 to 285. Despite the challenging conditions in terms of construction price inflation and the cost of borrowing, the MTFP proposals include £158.7 million of new capital expenditure plans, taking the MTFP 15 capital programme to £546.5 million over the next 4 years. The capital programme, including details of the new additions to the programme and the capital financing requirements linked to that programme, are set out at sections 286 to 314 in the report. The updated capital strategy and details of the individual schemes are set out at appendices 9, 10 and 11. Based on these budget proposals, the Council's net budget requirement will be £623.433 million next year, and details of the financing of this is set out at paragraph 150, with the gross and net expenditure for each service grouping included at Appendix 7, and the 25-26 revenue budget broken down by expenditure type at Appendix 6. Both these appendices include comparative information based on the current year's budget we agreed last year. In terms of the proposed council tax increases in 25-26, the budget includes a 2.99% base council tax increase next year, plus a 2% adult social care precept increase, meaning the overall increase will be 4.99% next year. The increases in 26-27 and beyond are modelled at 2.99% across each of the years of remaining in the MTFP period. The 25-26 budget proposals and the MTFP planning assumptions are in line with the government's expectations. A failure to increase council tax next year would increase the budget deficit we face. This would not be a strategy that I would recommend to Cabinet and Council, as it would create significant and unwarranted further budget challenges. Every 1% of council tax increase generates around £2.9 million of additional resources to help balance the budget. Or to put it another way, if the council does not maximise its council tax raising capacity, then the budget deficit would grow by £2.9 million for every 1% below the threshold set and assumed by central government. It is for these reasons, as Section 151 officer, I recommend to Cabinet and to Council that the increases factored into the 25-26 budgets and the MTFP forecasts are given very serious consideration, considering the impacts of not doing so. In considering these proposals, I would highlight that the most financially vulnerable residents are afforded significant protection here in Durham through our council tax reduction scheme. The budget proposals include new savings targets of £18.036 million next year, and in total £23.4 million over the 4-year period. Details of the savings included in the budget next year are set out from paragraphs 105 to 144, with details of individual proposals across the next 4 years set out at appendices 4 and 5. There is an equality impact assessment summarised in the report at paragraphs 183 to 221, with more details set out at Appendix 8. The updated MTFP model, which brings all of this together, is set out at Appendix 2. Members will note that even after the additional government funding set out in the report and the additional income from the proposed increases in council tax, and after the £18 million worth of savings are taken, there is still a budget deficit of £3.2 million, which we will need to meet from the MTFP support reserve next year. Members will also note that there is a funding gap of £45.5 million across the MTFP planning period. The risk assessment that underpins the budget and the MTFP forecasts are set out at section 380 to the report. Of particular concern is the significant uncertainty beyond 25-26 in terms of government funding levels. If the current spending forecasts that were set out in the autumn statement are retained for 26-27 and beyond, and local government remains an unprotected government department, then the sector could be faced with very tough settlements beyond next year. The government have, however, committed to providing multi-year settlements from 26-27, which is to be welcomed, and are undertaking a comprehensive spending review to inform them. They will also be undertaking a review of the funding formula used to distribute funding to individual authorities and have made some commitments to implementing this from 26-27. Details of the proposed local government funding reforms are set out at paragraphs 393 to 410, and the Council's view on the consultation questions is being sent to Government today. The budget and wider MTFP strategy presented in this report has been subject to consultation via our area action partnerships, through meetings arranged with our partners, trade unions and with business ratepayers. Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Management Board have met a number of times to consider the MTFP update reports that have been presented to Cabinet, and we'll meet tomorrow to consider this report. The views of the scrutiny members are set out in the report, and the outcome of the meeting tomorrow will be shared with all members in advance of the Council meeting next week. There is a comprehensive overview of the feedback received as part of the consultation, which was in 2 phases, set out at paragraphs 105 to 144 in the report. The report includes details of the various dedicated schools block funding allocations, and these are set out at sections 325 to 371. The increase in the schools block funding allocation next year is 27.25 million. The increase, however, includes a supplementary funding received in the current year, and if we exclude that, the year-on-year increase is more like 3.983 million. The updated school funding formula factors are set out at paragraph 343. The high needs funding is set to increase by £7.35 million next year, a year-on-year increase of 7.8%. However, this is much lower than the increase that is required to meet our statutory responsibilities in terms of expenditure, and will lead to a further escalation of the high needs deficit next year. As members will be aware, this is an area of our budget that has been under pressure for a number of years now. Members will also be aware that the in-year and cumulative deficits associated with high needs spending are being treated as outside of the Council's responsibility at this time, and the special account and override which applies in terms of the account and treatment of those deficits is due to end at the end of next financial year. So in 26-27, the deficit could manifest in the General Fund. Should this be the case, then it would cause a number of authorities across the country to go under. Our cumulative deficit is forecast to be around £23 million at the end of the current financial year, and is expected to increase to around £35 million at the end of next financial year. Details of the funding rates in the early years block of the dedicated schools grant are set out at paragraphs 360 to 365. Finally, Chair, and I appreciate this is a long and complex report. The report also details the required changes to the council tax section 13A policy, which includes the circumstances under which the council tax premiums are set aside to reflect the introduction of the second homes premium from April this year. The updated policy is attached to Appendix 15, and paragraphs 382 to 392 provide an overview of those changes. In concluding, Chair, we note that there is a series of detailed recommendations embedded within the report, with a summary of the recommendations to be made to Council set out at paragraph 46. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Paul. Can I invite Councillor Richard Bell, Deputy Leader of the Council and Cabinet Portfolio Holder for Finance, to move the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank the Resources Director, his team and officers across the Council for this comprehensive report, which is the culmination of many months of work by officers across all departments. It's the fourth and final report we will consider on our 25-26 budget proposals and MTFP 15 forecasts in advance of the budget setting process that will take place on 19th of February at full Council. As has been said, the final local government finance settlement was not published in time for this report, as it was only published on the 3rd of February, but the numbers are broadly in line with the provisional settlement, except for two issues. The grant that we will receive for the increase in direct employers' national insurance cost increases was around 300,000 less than the figures in this report, which leaves us £3.8 million short on national insurance reimbursement. However, there was a £300,000 increase in the new specific ring-fenced grant funding we are receiving for preventative work in children's social care. The 25-26 budgets need to make provision for significant inflationary pressures, including the impact of the 6.7% national living wage increase from April, which will have a significant bearing on our adult social care contracts in particular, but also impacts of the changes to employers' national insurance contributions on our suppliers, particularly in social care and home-to-school transport. As one would expect, the cost pressures in statutory adult and children's social care, which are by far the largest budgets the Council has, are enormous and unavoidable. This puts a squeeze in other budgets, particularly discretionary spend areas. The cost pressures in adult and children's social care total £34.5 million next year. The additional revenue generated from an adult social care precept of £5.8 million and the additional social care grant of £12 million totals £17.8 million and only covers half of the spending pressures in these areas, in part due to our low tax raising capacity, which is a matter I have consistently raised with governments of all colours. The cost pressures we face next year are enormous. They total £85.8 million, which includes £19.5 million of additional expenditure linked to new specific grant funding we'll receive next year. A significant budget pressure relates to placement costs for looked after children, which will need a budget increase of £16.6 million next year, and home to school transport, where a further £3 million will be added to that budget. Pay inflation is estimated to be 3% next year. Given that every 1% on the Council's pay bill is broadly equivalent to the income we can generate from 1% increase in council tax, this alone swallows up all of the additional revenue generated from the basic council tax increase. Added to that, pay is something that is negotiated nationally, and we have no control over a significant element of our budget. While the local government finance settlement provided us with some much-needed additional funding through the recovery grant, the cost pressures we face continue to significantly outstrip our local tax-raising capacity and the additional funding we are receiving, requiring the Council to use around £3.2 million of reserves to balance the budget next year. While the new recovery grant is welcomed and the methodology used to allocate this was wholeheartedly supported in our response to the consultation on the settlement, the withdrawal of the services grant has reduced funding by around £900,000, and as has been said, the reimbursement levels and distribution methodology for compensating for the impact of the increases in employers' national insurance costs for our directly employed workforce falls some £3.8 million of the costs we will incur, covering only around 54% of those costs, leaving us with a budget pressure next year, which is disappointing given the full reimbursement that was promised by the Chancellor at the time of her autumn budget statement. Despite these challenges, the budget makes provision for £1.1 million of investment in our special educational needs and development services to bolster the teams responsible for preparing education, health and social care plans, and includes £3 million of time-limited investment in our transformation programme capacity, which will be needed to support the ambitious plans set out to deliver the savings we will need in order to balance the budget from 26-27 onwards. The additional funding being provided by the Government next year totals £48.8 million, with 19.5 of this being specific ring-fenced grant funding. The core spending calculations the Government set out in the provisional settlement indicate an 8.2% increase for the Council next year, which is higher than the 6% national average increase, largely because of the inclusion of the new recovery grant funding, but also because this calculation again assumes the Council will increase its council tax by the maximum possible 4.99% next year. Given the financial outlook, we have had to give very careful consideration to any new prudential borrowing commitments at this time. It would be simply reckless and irresponsible to do otherwise, and this Cabinet is neither. The budget proposals do include £159 million of new capital investments funded from a combination of new additional government grants, £65 million, new prudential borrowing, £37.5 million, and new self-financed prudential borrowing, £55 million, plus some use of reserves, £2.9 million. The new capital spending commitments include a £55 million investment in the acquisition of the Milburn Gate development on a fully self-financed basis, significant continued investment in highways and bridges infrastructure of £49 million, investment in Net Park of £12.7 million in anticipation of a major inward investment opportunity, investment in the capitalised maintenance of our buildings of £8 million, increases in our demolitions budgets of £4 million to deal with the demolition of County Hall and other surplus buildings across the county, a £2 million investment in our Looked After Children Sufficiently strategy to increase in-house residential provision, and a £5.7 million investment in our digital infrastructure. When the time is right, that is when we have greater certainty and greater financial security, we will seek to invest further in our leisure facilities. The Cabinet retains an aspiration to bring forward new bill proposals for Chesley Street and Seaham, and will do so when it is prudent and affordable. Now is not that time, unfortunately. The overall capital programme for the MTF P15 planning period totals £546.5 million over the next 4 years. This is a significant level of capital investment. It does come at a cost, though, with £15.7 million of revenue budget growth required to finance the additional prudential borrowing needed across this MTFP planning period, much of which is linked to current existing commitments. Over the next 2 years, the Council will have to take out new external borrowing of £515 million to fund current commitments, more than doubling the level of external borrowing the Council holds. The timing of that borrowing and the interest rates that will apply is something I know our officers are carefully managing. The uncertainty which exists from 26-27 onwards continues to cast a shadow over our MTFP planning. There are significant concerns and uncertainty over what, if any, government funding increase we will receive from the revised approach to the funding formulae, which will be in no small part be linked to what impact of the review of the government spending will deliver in terms of its investment into the local government sector over the medium term, and on the pace of change in moving towards redistributing funding based on a new fairer formula. As I've said previously, it may well be probable that we end up with a bigger slice of a smaller cake. As things stand, the Council is facing a budget deficit of £23 million in 26-27. The report provides an overview of the government consultation on the reforms of the funding formula, which is around the key principles at this stage. The proposed formula has not yet been published, so we cannot yet model impacts. The Council has responded to that consultation today and made strong representations regarding the need to equalise council tax raising capacity, focus on deprivation-linked challenges and properly reflect the significant and enduring pressures in social care, particularly children's social care, in the new formula. We have also requested that those authorities that benefit from the new formula should receive that new funding immediately. The savings proposals we are considering today are largely in line with the proposals we previously considered, though we have carefully reflected on the consultation feedback and from representations from the Environment Scrutiny Committee and made some changes to the profiling of some of the neighbourhoods and climate change savings and removed a £40,000 saving that was to be taken from reducing the countryside ranges. The budget already included bolstering that service by mainstream funding a number of time-limited grant funding posts where the funding was due to expire next year as part of our commitment to the ecological emergency and in recognition of the significant volunteering capacity these posts unlock. We have also included the saving agreed by Council last month when the Independent Remuneration Panel recommendations on members' allowances were agreed, which results in a £284,000 additional saving from next year. I would once again like to thank everyone involved in the consultation exercise that's been undertaken. The feedback we have received, as updated further for the deliberations by the Corporate Overview and Scrutiny Management Board, is set out in detail in the report and has been carefully considered in finalising the plans. As has been said, the Management Board meets tomorrow to concentrate principally on the capital elements of this budget. The total identified savings across the MTF P15 planning period are £23.4 million, with £18 million or 77% of the savings falling into next year. The budget proposals include council tax increases in line with the government expectations. They take into account the council tax core referendum limits of 2.99% and the adult social care precept powers of an additional 2% next year. The forecasts for 26-27 and beyond factor in a 2.99% increase, as it is unclear whether the adult social care precept will continue beyond next year, 25-26. The clear expectation from government, as always, is that these additional flexibilities are taken, and as we have heard, the strong recommendation from our Section 151 officer is that the full council tax increase is taken also. Assuming that Council agrees the council tax increase is factored into this report and the updated savings proposals delivered, then the budget shortfall next year will be 3.191 million, rising to 45.5 million over the 4-year planning period. As I mentioned earlier, the budget shortfall presented to Council next week will be around £300,000 higher, and in total once the final settlement figures are reflected in that report. As is always the case, the estimates beyond next year are more indicative and will undoubtedly change, and there is significant uncertainty over the funding settlements beyond 25-26. Both of these factors could materially change the medium-term forecasts. That said, based on these forecasts, savings of around 23 million will be required to set a balanced budget in 26-27. Achieving savings of that size in 26-27 will be a significant undertaking and will require a fundamental rethink of what the Council does and a transformation of Council services and how we deliver them. Work on this has already commenced. We will have to continue to be flexible in our approach in terms of planning for the next 4 financial years so that we can continue to support residents in County Durham in the best way we can. A 4.99% increase in council tax next year represents an increase of around £1.24 a week for the majority of households across the county who reside in Band A properties. As has been said, those on low incomes fully protected through our local council tax reduction scheme. Government is clearly expecting local authorities to increase council tax in line with the new flexibilities and in particular the social care precept. It's important that we follow the advice of our Section 15 officer in terms of the sufficiency of our reserves. While our financial resilience has reduced in recent years, we are still in a stronger position than many other councils. That said, we cannot be complacent in this regard, and we must continue to act prudently. As the Corporate Director has also mentioned, the report also includes various updated policies, the updated pay policy, the updated Treasury Management Strategy and Prudential Indicators, and our updated Property Investment Strategy. These are all important documents, and in adopting these various policies and strategies is integral to us meeting our statutory requirements in terms of budget setting. With that, Chair, I'm happy to move the report and recommendations as set out in paragraph 46, including the amendments to the current capital programme as set out in the report.
Thanks, Richard. Can I also thank our officers for the work undertaken to prepare the budget proposals and the MTFP 15 update report we are considering today, and to Councillor Bell and others for their contributions to getting us to this stage. The report builds on the information we've already considered in September and December last year and in January this year. As has been highlighted, our budget next year is dominated by unavoidable inflationary and demand pressures, particularly in our statutory adults and children's social care services. I am particularly disappointed that we have been landed with a £3.5 million budget pressure, which will rise to a £3.8 million budget pressure once the final settlement figures are plugged in, for the changes being made to employers' national insurance contributions on our direct staffing costs. If the government had honoured its commitment to fully reimburse us for those changes, we would have had a balanced budget next year. The budget includes another £400,000 required uplift next year to fund the gap between the housing benefit we must pay out in respect of temporary and supported housing linked to homelessness and the subsidy or grant we claim back on these payments, building on the £2.6 million we had to find this year. This, quite frankly, is a disgrace and something that ought to be remedied by government. How can it be right that the council taxpayers in County Durham must subsidise this? We administer housing benefit on behalf of the DWP. The guidance and funding we can claim comes from the DWP, and they should fully fund this. It is not right that local council taxpayers will have a £3 million burden placed on them for this next year. I welcome the receipt of the additional funding announced by the Government, particularly the Recovery Grant, and the distribution methodology used to allocate this next year. We are once again faced with only a one-year settlement, which has perpetuated the uncertainty we have faced for many years now. The Government has committed to undertaking a comprehensive spending review and providing a multi-year settlement from 26-27, and as part of this undertake a fundamental review of the formula used to allocate funding to each authority, stating that greater weight will be put on council tax raising capacity and on needs driven by higher levels of deprivation. I welcome these announcements, but let's not kid ourselves. The Government are in a difficult place in terms of the national finances, so I doubt whether investment in this sector, a non-protected government department at the moment, that is so badly needed will be forthcoming and fundamental. The radical change in the formula, which would benefit authorities like ourselves, will be met with severe resistance from those that will lose out, and the pace of change could be longer than we would desire. Living from year to year and receiving funding notifications late in the budget planning cycle isn't conducive to good financial planning. At this stage of the budget setting process, we have sought to involve scrutiny, and the report includes details of the feedback from those meetings and from wider engagement through our area action partnerships and through engagement with business ratepayers and with trade unions on the budget strategy and savings proposals. The Scrutiny Committee will meet tomorrow to consider this report, and the feedback from that meeting will be presented to Council next week. It is frustrating that we still lag behind the national average core spending power per dwelling, and as the report outlines, if we had the funding in line with the national average per dwelling, be it from additional government grant or from council tax revenues, then we would have a further £31 million available to us next year. Sadly, we don't. The savings proposals set out in the report have been updated and total £18.033 million next year and £23.4 million over the 4-year period. Without these savings next year, the Council was facing a budget deficit of £21.2 million. This is the underlying shortfall between the expenditure pressures we face and the additional grant and council and business rates income that we can generate. The savings proposals we have developed have reduced that deficit to £3.2 million, and that is what the level of reserves we will have to use to balance our budget next year. Many councils are already on the brink. Not all of these are down to bad decision-making or poor governance, as the government will have you believe. Many well-run councils are getting to the point where they are close to Section 114 territory. The system is broken and is in need of urgent reform if councils like ourselves are to survive and thrive going forward. Our only hope is that the government sees through on its commitment to change the distribution mechanism, placing greater emphasis on council tax equalisation and on deprivation, which would benefit us and correct the adjustments to the distribution formula. Utilising reserves to balance the budget next year is clearly not a sustainable position to be in and can only be accommodated on a short-term basis. As I have said many times in the past, increasing the council tax is a decision that should not be taken lightly, and we must recognise the squeeze on the cost of living for all our residents. However, not increasing council tax is simply not a sustainable or prudent strategy to adopt and would not be in line with the government's expectations and in line with the advice from our Section 151 officer. If we didn't increase council tax on our 2025-26 budget, and our medium-term financial planning position would be much worse than it is. It is effectively a binary choice between implementing council tax increases versus increasing the cuts to the vital public services. It is important, however, to recognise that those on low income in County Durham are afforded significant protection through access to support from our council tax reduction scheme, and I am proud that County Council endorsed the continuation of our scheme into next year, which, unlike virtually every other council in the country, does not seek to limit or cap the level of support working age households can receive. This administration has delivered significant investment over the last 3 years and continues to invest in our assets and core infrastructure for the benefits of residents. Of course, we've had to tailor our capital programme to the resources available to us at this time, as mentioned by Councillor Bell. But this administration will not adopt a policy of making announcements about unfunded, undeliverable schemes. Nevertheless, the MTFP 15 capital programme includes a further £159 million of new capital spending commitments and will total £546.5 million across the MTFP planning period. £55 million of this is the investment relates to a report we'll consider later on the acquisition of the Milburn Gate development, an investment which I would note which should be noted that will be fully self-financing and will not impact on council taxpayers, as the income that will be received from tenants will fully pay for the loan costs we would incur in stepping in and resolving this situation. Our capital programme would of course been around £50 million higher had the new Labour government honoured the commitments given by the previous government in terms of the additional transport capital grant we were due to receive in compensation for us being excluded from the CRSTS allocations within the combined authority next year and the year after. The loss of that £50 million of funding will mean we will only be able to deliver less than a third of the schemes we were planning on delivering over the next 2 years. It is important that we follow the advice of our Section 151 officer in terms of the adequacy of our reserves and ensure the financial resilience of the Council. The report provides an update of our relative position compared to other authorities using the recently published SIPFA Resilience Index. Given the scale of the challenges we face, it is more important than ever that we have a well-managed medium-term financial planning process. We need to ensure we plan sufficiently well ahead, that we take the tough decisions on council tax and on savings, and that we do not use reserves to unsustainable levels going forward. We don't have to look very far to see where local authorities haven't planned ahead and where things like huge infrastructure projects are failing and they haven't been addressed. I support the proposed transformation programme. The investment being made in this will need to harvest significant savings opportunities and help manage demand to help balance our budgets from 2026-27 onwards. And with that, I would ask Cabinet to note the report and agree the recommendations set out at paragraph 46. Is there anyone from Cabinet wish to speak to the report, please? Councillor Wilkes.
Thank you, Chair. After the Government's budget in October, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was very clear that the National Insurance cost increases would not impact upon local government because we'd be fully recompensed. This is not the case, as has already been said, and we've been saddled with many millions of pounds of additional costs from the government too. I find it completely disingenuous for a government to put out what in effect are lies about funding. But it goes further than that, because the impact of last year's budget is massively greater and is also hitting our suppliers and indeed charities across the county which assist in protecting the most vulnerable. All this leads me to believe that down the line, the impact of last year's government's budget is going to push up costs to councils even more. Unless government recognises the work which councils do and the financial pressures that they are placing on us, the connection between the services we offer and the support we have from residents is going to be tested even more. The government is forcing councils to increase council tax under threat of losing funding, upping our costs at the same time and hitting our residents in the pocket too. It can't continue, and the ripple effects from this will be plain to see in our communities if the government doesn't change direction. Chair, I also echo your comments about the £50 million that Labour has in effect stolen from our county for infrastructure and transport, money which could have been spent on the reopening of the Belmont Viaduct or building the Bowburn Relief Road. Chair, despite all the financial pressures placed on us by government, we've got a budget to take to full council, which we can support, a budget which continues to invest in our county, helping to boost our economy, whilst ensuring that the services which our residents rely on will continue in the coming year at least. This budget is also a recognition of the excellent cross-party working of the last few years with this joint administration. And I'm proud as a Liberal Democrat and as a member of this joint administration of what we've achieved and of the efforts of everyone who works for Durham County Council, from the Chief Executive right through to our officers working on the ground in our communities, and both Cabinet and non-Cabinet members, without whose support we wouldn't have been able to achieve so much. I support the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak? Councillor Shuttleworth.
Just touching on what Councillor Wilkes said, I just think people need to know out there that the national insurance is affecting all of the public sector. So up and down the country, it's not only councils, it's police, and it's also such as fire. And as chair of the fire authority, we weigh about 400 grand adrift, which isn't helpful. But the idea of it's not going to affect every man, woman and child, it is going to affect every man, woman and child, and I think people need to know that. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. I think it's worth highlighting again, while the 6.8% uplift in our grant was most welcome, percentage terms are always nice to hear, and I think all too often we use them too often. But to reiterate the fact that if we were funded fairly on per household, we would be better off to the tune of £31 million a year. And that's year on year this has happened. And I would also like to thank Councillor Bell for continuing to highlight our low council tax base. This is, of course, because of the totally unfair and outdated council tax system we have at the moment, and the fact that this government, as previous governments have been called for, should undertake a total reform of the system. Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to speak on the report? Okay, can we agree the report and its recommendations? Agreed. Thank you. Can confirm the recommendations are agreed. Item 5, school admission arrangements for the academic year 2026 to 27. Can I invite John Pierce, Corporate Director of Children and Young People Services, to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. The purpose of the report is to request Cabinet approval for the proposed school admissions arrangements and oversubscription criteria for community and voluntary controlled schools for the 2026-27 academic year. It's a mandatory requirement of the School Admissions Code that all schools must have clear admissions arrangements describing how children will be admitted and their individual oversubscription criteria. The Council is the admissions authority for community and voluntary controlled schools and is required to agree those admissions arrangements for schools annually. If there are changes to the admissions arrangements, they must be consulted upon for a minimum 6-week period between October and January, prior to the deadline for the Admissions Authority to approve the arrangements, which is by February the 28th each year. There are no changes proposed in the report to the current admissions arrangements that require public consultation. In addition, there is a requirement to consult as a minimum within a 7-year period. Consultation was last undertaken in 2022, so we are within that 7-year requirement. The proposed admissions numbers recommended for each community and voluntary controlled school in the county are listed in the report in Appendix 2. The admissions numbers advised by governing bodies, voluntary aided schools and academies who are their own admissions authorities are included to be noted for information. The full admissions policies and oversubscription criteria are included as Appendix 3. Cabinet's asked to approve the recommendations which are in paragraph 4 of the report. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Can I now invite Councillor Ted Henderson, Cabinet Portfolio Holder for Children and Young People Services, to move the report.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to present this report on the Council's proposed admission arrangements for the 2026-27 academic year. These arrangements have been produced following a consultation with schools, the admission authorities, governing bodies and the parents. There were no changes proposed to the admission arrangements approved for 26-27, apart from the changes to the admission amount for a small number of schools. The admission arrangements ensure that as many parents as possible are provided with a place at one of their preferred schools. The authority regularly achieves in excess of 92% of pupils receiving their first preference of primary and secondary school. This comfortably exceeds the first preference percentage met by other councils, both regionally and nationally. The education remains a key priority for the council, and the positive outcomes we seek to achieve are contributed to by pupils being provided with places in schools their parents and carers want them to attend. I recommend the report and the decision it takes the Cabinet to agree. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Ted. Can I invite Councillor Susan MacDonald to second the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to second this report, which asks Cabinet to agree the admission arrangements for 2026-27, and would like to thank our schools and academies for their support in ensuring our admission processes are fair and transparent for all of our communities. The admission arrangements outlined in the report are clear, easy to understand, and therefore will help parents and carers when deciding which schools they would prefer their child to attend. It's pleasing to note that the Council continues to enable a high percentage of pupils to be offered a place at their preferred school. I therefore second the report and the decision it asks Cabinet to agree. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Susan. Is anyone else wishing to speak on the report? Can we agree the report and its recommendations?
Agreed.
Okay, can confirm the recommendations are agreed. Item 6 is East Durham Community Athletics Track option agreement and ground lease at less than best consideration. Can I invite Paul Darby, Corporate Director of Resources, to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. This report provides the background information necessary for Cabinet to consider a request from the East Durham Community Athletics Track Group, EDCAT, for the Council to grant an option agreement on 16.2 acres of land at Net Park, which is currently included in the local plan as land for industrial development. The primary objective of the option agreement is to remove the specified land from the Net Park available developable area, to provide EDCAT with the necessary legal rights and time to develop a robust and sustainable business plan to build and run the envisaged facilities, and to give EDCAT the certainty on access to a lease on the land on which to build the proposed facility should they meet the conditions as set out in the report. The terms of the proposed option agreement and proposed lease that would be triggered if EDCAT satisfy the conditions is set out in Appendix 3. The site in question and the proposed outline plans for the athletics track, changing facilities and associated car parking is set out in Appendix 2. As members will note, EDCAT have been in active discussions with the Council over many years to identify and secure an appropriate site for their planned athletics facilities in this part of the county, and have gained conditional planning approval for the development of these facilities on the land at Net Park. The report sets out the less than best considerations that Cabinet need to be minded to in terms of agreeing to the lease of this land to EDCAT on a peppercorn lease, compared to the potential value if and when it was developed for industrial use in the future. This is something that members must weigh against the community benefits that such a facility could bring once developed. That said, as the report highlights, the Council has significant landholdings at Net Park, and even if the proposals in this report are agreed, there would still be sufficient land available for development over the next 20 plus years at Net Park. It is also important to note that at no point will the freehold of this site transfer to EDCAT. The proposed options agreement to be offered is for 2 years, which should give EDCAT sufficient time to secure the funding and develop a detailed business plan to satisfy the Council's conditions. Within the Council's registered title for the site, the Church Commissioners for England have a qualified title for freehold mines and minerals, that they will therefore need to be consulted on and give their written consent for development. The Church Commissioners have, however, been approached to ascertain whether they will agree to the construction of the running track and associated facilities on the site, and they have proposed that a deed of grant of easement, with a caveat that the easement granted is time matched to the proposed lease, could be agreed. The estimated cost of this easement include the consideration sum of £10,000 subject to legal fees. The Council has agreed that it will meet these costs and reasonable legal fees, and this will be funded from existing budgets held for the Net Park development. The Council has been clear throughout its dialogue with EDCAT that the Council would not welcome any request from EDCAT for any additional funding from the Council beyond this commitment, either revenue or capital, towards the construction or running of this facility. The recommendations, Chair, are set out in paragraph 34. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Can I invite Councillor James Rowlandson, Cabinet Portfolio Holder for Resources, Investments and Assets, to move the report?
Thank you, Chair. Can I start by thanking the officers for the work undertaken to prepare this report, particularly those of the Corporate Property and Land team and our Culture, Sports and Leisure team, who have given their support to the East Durham Community Athletics Track volunteers over the last 15 years to help them develop their ambitious plans to bring a new community athletics track and associated changing and parking facilities to this part of the county. The creation of this facility is a long-standing community aspiration with strong local support and has been under discussion since 2010. The Council has worked closely with EDCAT to identify an appropriate site in this locality. The report sets out the implications of us agreeing to provide EDCAT with an option agreement on land at Net Park, which would trigger a 30-year lease at a peppercorn rent if EDCAT are successful in securing the necessary capital finance to build the facilities and providing they furnish us with a robust business plan to demonstrate that they have the capacity to run and maintain such a facility once built. Whilst the site they require amounts to 16 acres, the Council will still retain over 100 acres of a developable employment land at Net Park after the current extension is completed, a land supply of around 20 years at least. Losing any employment land is not a decision to be taken lightly, and the implications of doing so is fully set out in the report, with the undervalued consideration rightly highlighted in terms of the opportunity cost of agreeing to the lease arrangement. The Council has been clear throughout its engagement with EDCAT that other than agreeing to the option agreement and associated lease terms as set out in this report, the Council will not commit to any other funding, revenue or capital for the building and running costs of the proposed facilities. The 2-year option agreement will provide EDCAT with the sufficient time and legal interest in the site to be able to submit funding applications to secure the necessary finance to build the facilities. If they fail to do so, the option agreement will expire and the land will be retained. If the lease is triggered, then theoretically the land will be brought back into the council use after 30 years, after the 30-year lease term is expired. However, in reality, this has to be acknowledged that once the land is given over for recreational and sport use, there will be little prospect of ever being brought back into the use of the employment land in the future. And this is something I must acknowledge in making this decision. With that, I would ask the Cabinet to note the report and formally move the recommendation set out in paragraph 24. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, James. Can I invite Councillor Elizabeth Scott, Cabinet Portfolio Holder for Economy and Partnerships, to second the report?
Thank you, Chair. Can I also thank our officers for the work undertaken to support the East Durham Community Athletics Track volunteers over many years and for the proposals that we have before us today. Net Park is an outstanding success story. In many ways, it's the jewel in the crown of our inclusive economic strategy, with huge potential for future expansion. The current expansion, agreed by this Cabinet in September 2021, is seeing 270,000 square feet of new lab, office, production and storage space being made available, driven by demand from existing Net Park tenants who wish to expand their operations and potentially bring further inward investment to the site. It is anticipated this expansion will help achieve the creation of up to 1,250 skilled jobs, adding over 625 million in gross value added to the County Durham economy. The Net Park site currently has 116 acres of undeveloped land, once Phase 3 and 3A are fully developed. Removing the proposed site from the developable area would still leave 100 acres of land available for further expansion of Net Park over the next 20 years. Transferring the site to EdCat through a long lease at a peppercorn rent by initially entering into an option agreement as detailed in this report will hopefully unlock the funding they need. Once developed, the athletics track and associated facilities will help promote health and well-being and provide athletic sporting activities for the benefit of the local community and wider athletic clubs in the area, facilities that are just not available or accessible in this part of the county. It would honour a commitment given to EdCat over many years to help them identify an appropriate site and assist them in bringing forward a sustainable capital and revenue business plan. With that, I ask Cabinet to note the report and formally second the recommendation set out at paragraph 34.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to the report? Okay. Can we agree the report and its recommendations? Agreed. Okay. I can confirm that the recommendations are agreed. Item 7, there's no other business in the public part of this meeting. So can I thank members of the public who've watched online and for people who've attended. Item 8, can I have a mover and a seconder, please, to exclude the public?
Move for that, Chair.
You, seconder?
Second, Chair.
Ask Cabinet to agree that resolution.
Agreed.
Thank you.